Hello, I'm Richard Brown and I'm a reader in modern literature in the School of English in the University of Leeds. Now, in the first of these two podcasts which I've been giving, I sketched out 5 questions or groups of questions which can help us to read any novel with an informed awareness of its narrative form. But I ended up with something of a warning. Many critics, certainly most university examiners, would agree that an awareness of form is essential to any fully successful reading of a work of literary art. Yet many would also want to resist succumbing completely to that school of academic criticism which is sometimes called formalism, on which I drew for most of my questions in that podcast. To be only formalistic in one's approach to fiction these days, and still more to apply a system of formalistic reading in a rigidly schematic or mechanical way, would risk seeming dry or abstract. It might also tend to obscure all important aspects of the ways in which novels are part of the historical context in which they were written and read. What's more, it might distract us from paying proper attention to a whole series of urgent ethical and political questions to do with sexuality, race, gender, the legacy of colonialism, the nature of human or even post-human subjectivity, the conditions of modern or postmodern society or the environment, which students of the humanities quite rightly want to discuss and which the novel as a literary form is ideally placed to bring up. Well-researched information about historical contexts and the application of well-defined social and philosophical ideas informs most, if not all, of the best of contemporary critical work. In trying to spell out those basic strategies of narrative writing that any writer is going to use and any reader might find in what they read, I was also highly conscious that some of the most creative cultural minds of the modern world have wrestled with problems of narrative and meaning and come up with some thoroughly brilliant answers in theoretical terms, and also with countless fantastic examples of readings of particular narrative texts, precisely by resisting any simple pre-formulated method or scheme. That thought brings to mind the root sense of the word novel, which implies that it should be precisely that, new and unprecedented and unpredictable, that it should be novel. So in thinking about how to read a novel, we also need to bear in mind that there's more than one kind of approach to a novel's meaning, and that the best kinds of reading can come from a range of more or less well-defined or else carefully blended kinds of intellectual approach, or, more worryingly, of no approach at all. My title for this podcast, An Approach to Meaning and Context, is intended to give some basic clues as to how to proceed here. On the one hand, I want to talk about a novel's meaning, but then also suggest that the kinds of meaning we bring to it may be informed by all kinds of strategy and by different kinds of awareness of context. And finally, that any particular context that may inform our reading is in the end only one of many that may be brought to bear. In constructing these thoughts in 2011, I'm also sitting on a body of largely continental European theoretical writing, much of which chooses to go to the literary, aesthetic or cultural text precisely because it defies the pre-programmed or the pre-formulated and seeks instead for those special kinds of insight or experience that the unpredictability and uniqueness of the literary or aesthetic work alone can provide. From the simplest local gloss of a word or reference which we don't immediately recognize, to the larger interpretation or reading of a literary work as a whole, we'll need a flexible and appropriate response to the particular text, and also an informed sense of history that supports our reading without tying it down. During the last years of the last century, there was a highly influential school of European cultural theory that drew upon or defined itself as post-formalist or else deconstructive. The leading theorist of this school was the famous French thinker Jacques Derrida, whose early work proceeded from a profound philosophic skepticism about hermeneutics, or the process of interpretation itself, which he revealed to be fundamentally circular. His many brilliant readings of literary and philosophic texts threw lights on those texts whilst leaving that fundamental principle intact. Another influential critic, Susan Sontag, wrote at that time against interpretation itself in a book of that name. Another important and exhilarating French theorist, Gilles Deleuze, one of whose favourite novels to discuss was Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, went back to the long history of interpretation to try to undercut the implied theory or depth model of meaning in a long tradition of thought going back to Plato in favour of an idea of reading surfaces for themselves, which he drew instead from a different ancient source in the philosophy of the Stoics. The implications of this kind of thought for the interpretation of texts such as novels, or the revelation of some hidden meaning in them, for example, the enclosed kinds of interpretation that some of the more reductive types of Freudian psychoanalysis or some types of Marxist politics might have produced, are profound. Though, of course, most would say that a more sophisticated awareness of that Freudian and post-Freudian tradition of psychoanalysis or of post-Marxist traditions of thinking about society remains a very powerful and necessary element in much modern understanding of literary texts. A fully fledged Derridean would quite rightly disagree, but it seems fair to say that for all the importance of this kind of highly sceptical deconstructive approach, its weakness would be that it, too, can tend to deflect attention away from historical, ethical and political readings, from that list of important contemporary issues which I began this podcast by saying could provide vital and important ways into reading a novel. So, where do we go from here? One highly important tradition of modern critical thought in the humanities emerges from the culturally sophisticated school of political thought represented by the German critic Walter Benjamin. In his famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Its Mechanical Reproduction, Benjamin argued that, traditionally, works of art drew for their significance and sense of value from what he called the aura of their uniqueness, and that this was something related to an idea of the sacred. As modern societies came to industrialize and mass-produce art for a mass audience, this kind of significance, he argues, gives way to a significance which emerges from a sense of the political. This and other related approaches which foreground the political meaning of a text, however broadly that's defined, and especially such approaches which also draw on a complex sense of human subjectivity that can be drawn from psychoanalysis, remain fully current in contemporary criticism of the novel, and especially in the obligations it puts on the reader to see novels as revealing things about the human mind, whilst also being engaged, whether consciously or unconsciously, in certain key political debates and contexts. Can we, in the simplest terms, fully understand the experimental modernism of Virginia Woolf without realizing that she writes as a woman, and with an awareness that the whole history of writing up to her time might need to be challenged in order to allow a newly gendered voice to come across? Can we understand the modern African novel without locating its significance in the emerging cultural consciousness of the countries and peoples of Africa? Most critics and readers these days would immediately respond that we cannot. Now, another influential theorist in this continental European tradition that grew up at the end of the last century, Michel Foucault, was important in expanding the idea of the political in modern societies to include all aspects of private and personal life, which may now come into the complex arena of the relation of the individual to power. For Foucault, for example, the history of sexuality was a vital part of the history of modernity. Indeed, Foucault's famous history of sexuality traces the extent to which meaning itself in the modern world becomes more and more attached to the meaning of sexuality. Freudianism itself can be seen as an important part of that history. And from this point of view, the representations of everyday life, of psychological interiority and of gender and sexuality that are so prominent in modern narrative prose fiction become an essential topic for analysis in the post-Foucauldian world.